In today's mini lesson, we'll be covering voice, which is a dimension of language that is used to describe how the verb form shows the relationship between the subject of the sentence and the verb. So this is a dimension of how speakers use language and how they actually speak. And in English, this is split up into active and passive voice. However, if you know other languages or are planning on studying language, you may encounter other languages that also have a middle voice. But for English, we have active and passive. And while we go through these sentences, we want to consider the important questions: who is completing the action and who is receiving the action. So for active sentences, I have Sam bought the apples, Mark released the bowl, and Derek spilled the milk. In all of these sentences, the subject of the sentence, so Sam, Mark, and Derek, are the entities that are completing the action. However, the object, the apples, the bowl, and the milk, are the ones receiving the action, because the milk is the thing being spilled. Then, in the passive sentences, I have the apples were bought by Sam, the bowl was released by Mark, and the milk was spilled by Derek. In these sentences, who is completing the action is now the object, by Sam, by Mark, and by Derek. However, what is receiving the action is now the subject, the apples, the bowl, and the milk. Furthermore, with these passive constructions, I included some parentheses around by Sam, by Mark, and by Derek because these are optional. You could include by Sam in the sentence, but you could also say the apples were bought. Then I have some form work where an active sentence is a subject agent, a main verb, and an object theme. And then we want to talk a little bit about what an agent and a theme are. So much like the questions in the last slide, the person or thing that completes the action of the verb is the agent. So the answer to our first question will be who the agent is in the sentence. Then our theme is the object that's being acted on by the agent. So that's going to be what is receiving the action of the verb. And then this verb can be any tense. She kicked the ball, which is past. She will kick the ball, which is future. And she kicks the ball, which is present. Furthermore, active sentences can have any aspect to them as well. You may have heard of the perfect tense or the progressive tense. However, we'll be covering more in depth aspect in a later lesson. And then for passive, it's a subject theme instead of a subject agent, the verb, and then an object agent instead of an object theme. And then, as we talked about in the definition in the first slide, it's about how the verb form communicates this relationship. So our verb form in the passive sentence is going to be a little bit different than the verb that we use in the active sentence. In the active sentence, we have a verb conjugated for tense, kicked, kick, will kick, kicks. However, in our passive sentence, we have the verb be, which will be conjugated based on the subject, with the third form. So the verb be must be conjugated to fit the sentence, fit the subject, and the tense. So, for example, the apples were, but the bowl was. And in this example, both of these conjugations of be are past tense. However, the plurality of the subject makes the conjugation different. So because the apples is plural, we have were, and the bowl is singular, we have was. And then also, sometimes be shows up, which might look unconjugated. For example, in the future tense, the apples will be, where will is carrying the tense because, and be doesn't necessarily get conjugated. And then the third form looks like a past tense verb, so we want to be very careful because it can be confusing that might be our main verb of these passive sentences. So going back to the example sentences from slide 1, we had spilled, bought, and released, which are all past participles instead of main verbs. So a participle is just a verby thing, but it isn't a main verb. So I included an example of an active present sentence that turns into a passive present sentence. She kicks the ball, which is active, to the ball is kicked by her, which is passive. And here we can see by the conjugation of the verb be to is that it's a present sentence. However, we still have that past participle kicked that's attached. So here I have built out a little bit more of this form with the actual example sentences attached. So in the active sentence, Sam bought the apples. Sam is an agent subject, and the apples is an object theme. So then in the passive sentence, the apples is a subject theme, and by Sam is an agent object. So important things to notice, the position before the verb is subject position. So regardless in the active and the passive sentence, when the item showed up before the verb, it was a subject. So Sam, the subject of the active sentence, and the apples, the subject of the passive sentence. Then that means the position after the verb is the object position. In the first sentence, or in the active sentence, the apples, and then in the passive sentence, by Sam. However, this differs from agent and theme because Sam is the agent of both the active and the passive sentence, while the apples are the theme of both the active and the passive sentence. So therefore, we can kind of conclude that agent and theme are more related to the meaning of the sentence, while object and subject are more related to the structure and the grammar of the sentence. And then we also notice the passive construction switches the subject and the object, and the passive construction does not require an agent but can have one, which is shown by the parentheses. And then also we do see what we talked about in the last slide of the be verb plus the past participle or the third form in the passive construction. Then for meaning and use of these passive and active sentences, we have a little bit more information. So above I had the same active sentences, but turned into a passive construction. And this is something that is done a lot. However, the context that active and passive sentences are used are for the most part very different. So active sentences are used when the person or thing completing the action or the agent is known, and used when this agent or person, thing completing the action is the most important information. And then also it's more of a direct form of communication. You'll see this a lot in informal contexts, people just sort of talking here and there. And then the passive is used when the person or thing completing the action isn't known, or the agent isn't the most important information, or the action is being hidden by the speaker. So examples of these, when the person or thing completing the action is unknown, you might not know who maybe broke something. So you might say the toaster was broken because you can tell that it was beaten. Like somebody must have done it. There must have been an agent, but you don't know who did it. Or you might hear the Declaration of Independence was signed, where the fact that the Declaration was signed is the most important information, and the group of people that signed it is less important in that story. And then when the action is being hidden, I always think of this like, you broke the TV and you don't want to tell your mom you broke the TV, so you might say the TV was broken, and trying to omit the fact that I broke the TV, you want to make it a little more vague so that, mom might not immediately assume it was you. And then another thing about the passive is it's used a lot in professional context and in writing. Research papers is a big area where passive voice is encouraged. Something you might see is 6 papers were researched instead of I researched 6 papers. Getting rid of those personal pronouns and sort of eliminating you as the agent and person doing all of it.